let's get to this first here.
Paul, you've just ruined Nicholas's re-election campaign by aligning him with me. But it's great to have Nicholas back. Great to have you back on Monday nights.
Well, and I know that there's going to be a massive agree-a-thon here because I talked about this last night, which was old mate Chris Bowen. Just now that they've won, they'll never be challenged into the future. There's no opposition, intellectual or otherwise, to the constant march of the Labor Party, is that despite the fact that Orange Man Bad is putting tariffs on steel, and that's bad because it makes things more expensive for the American consumer, Chris Bowen is openly talking about us introducing tariffs on imports coming from anywhere in the world that may well be carbon intensive. So say a car or a fridge, let alone thousands and thousands of other products that come into the country. So I don't understand. Orange Man Bad when it comes to tariffs. Bowen just mad when it comes to tariffs here. This is in part what he had to say yesterday on the ABC.
I know you've been looking at the option of Australia imposing a carbon tariff or a carbon border adjustment mechanism, as the Europeans are looking at. What's your thinking on that at the moment?
Well, we've been, again, clear that we want to ensure Australian industry is best placed to compete in a decarbonising world. As you know, I commissioned Professor Frank Iozzo last year to advise the government. He's made public consultation papers. Those papers make clear he thinks the settings are right in the short term, but there are things we can think about in the medium to long term. And obviously that's something I'll continue to progress this term with my cabinet colleagues.
So, Matt, buried in the paperwork, not mentioned for the past few months, but something that they're willing to be out and proud about as something. Now, help me out. Steel tariff bad, carbon tariff good.
Well, Paul, you've identified the international inconsistency here, rightly so, but I'd like to just focus on a bit more of a domestic inconsistency. Please. Because, Paul, well, riddle me this, Batman. I mean, how is it that apparently renewable energy is cheaper and helps us reduce the cost of doing things, yes, but then we need to put a tariff in place to protect the businesses that are forced to use the renewable energy? Those two things don't add up here. The very fact that Chris Bowen has had to say that he has to put on a tariff to protect our steel, our aluminium, our cement industries completely blows his case out of the water that somehow going to net zero is not going to cost the Australian people anything extra, or indeed, as they were promising, they said it was going to be cheaper. We're going to get cheaper power prices. Things would be better. Well, if they were going to be better and cheaper and easier, why do they need these tariffs to protect our industries that are competing against countries that are not pursuing net zero or not decarbonising in the language that Chris Bowen has used? That inconsistency blows the government's argument completely out of the water, and it is about time that we have a proper costing of how much is net zero, is this goal costing the Australian people. That's never been done. We've never had a full proper costing in this country of how much pursuing net zero would cost. We've usually had a bunch of hand waving about how, no, it's not going to cost any money because renewable energy is cheaper and it's going to be even better for everybody. Well, the government's policy here on tariffs totally shows that to be a lie, and I think the Australian people deserve to know the truth.
Nick, you've just done a budget for the city. You'd be fine to pay, 10% more for things that you use that have been imported from carbon-intensive countries?
Well, I think what Chris Bowen's saying here actually makes a lot of sense. In the Straight Talk Express from Melbourne, I'm happy to explain it to Matt and anyone else who wants to tune in here. Of course, the world is decarbonising, and that's a good thing. China. It means we're going to have a cleaner planet and will be a better planet as well. And what we don't want to have happen in Australia is that companies try and offshore their emitting activities and avoid our environmental laws. Nobody in Australia would want to see that happen. And so I think Chris Bowen is just making the sensible selection. If you're going to try and get around our environmental laws by offshoring your emitting activities, well, we're not going to have a bar of that in Australia. You'd be fine. I think that makes perfect sense. Now,
the second point here, and then Matt, you're back in. But Nick, my issue is, right, if the cost of Australian steel going into the United States is now 25% more expensive equals Orange Man Bad, how is it that all of the things that we take out of the ground and send to the rest of the world, which a major proportion of things like company tax, let alone mining taxes, all the rest of it, that those too might get 25% put on them, because that's what the Europeans are talking about. How would that not be exactly the same thing?
Because, Donald Trump's steel tariffs are stupid America First policies, which are actually going to make America poorer. Whereas the idea of carbon tariffs are there to achieve a stated and sound policy aim, which is to stop companies offshoring their emitting practices to avoid Australian environmental law. So one is to a good end, what's being proposed in Australia.
Trump
the other
bad,
is to
Bowen good.
a fool's end. A fool's end. No, I've explained it to you. Now, going back to... I was going to explain Matt Canavan's riddle to everyone earlier.
Let's bring Matt in. Let's have a chat going. All right, go. Keep going.
So I remember this debate from years ago, and it's great to be back, and I'll re-explain it to Matt. So old coal is cheaper than new renewables. But of course, new renewables are cheaper than new coal. And so, yes, there are these old coal clunkers out there, these old coal-fired power stations, which have completely depreciated in value and can produce energy very cheaply. Of course, they're ruining the planet, but they do produce cheap power, at least in financial terms, on the books of the companies that own them. But as we move to decarbonising our planet, new renewables are cheaper than new coal. But for the time being, we've got a situation where new renewables are cheaper. New renewables at the moment are more expensive than old coal.
Okay.
But as we transition...
I'm glad Nick's just admitted that it is more costly, because it's costly to shut down an old coal-fired power station. That's a cost. It's a cost to the Australian consumer. It's a cost to Australian industry, because we could run those cheap. You've admitted that they're cheaper. Those cheap coal-fired power stations longer. The second problem with your argument, Nick, is that China's not using. They're the competitors here we're talking about. Let's face it, is China. They're not using old coal-fired power stations. They're building new ones. They're building new ones 2 times a week. And so they're still apparently cheaper than our new renewables. That doesn't make any sense. But at the core of this argument, Paul, I'll sum this argument up.
Please.
I'll sum this argument up. If I put this red hat on, Paul, if I put this red hat on and say tariffs are good, that's bad. That's really bad. If I take the red hat off and say tariffs are good, they're good. That's the argument. That's their argument. Yeah. It's totally about the red hat. It's got nothing more than that.
Well done. Well done. All right.
It's if they're going to build new coal and try and sell it back to us and avoid our environmental laws, we're on them, right? And we're going to put a carbon tariff on them to catch them out. That's what's going to happen.
Hang on. Okay, Australia makes...
just Donald Trump. You're exactly the same as Trump.
I'm going to go there, all right? Australia makes zero cars, Nick. Zero. Zero electric cars, zero petrol cars, okay? Steel is involved in those things, okay? Now, even if they are paid for and powered by hydrogen or green steel or whatever, right? It's still going to be a carbon-intensive industry, meaning that a tax would be put on every metal car coming into the country. Wouldn't that be one of the consequences here?
No, the tax would apply when a company is trying to avoid or offshore its emitting practices and avoid Australian environmental laws. That's when you'd be using it.
Okay, so you're... Now, again, this is very wide, it's very vague, and Nicholas isn't Chris Bowen, but it'll be fascinating to see the further conversation.
There's a broader point here, though, Paul. I mean, why don't, Nick, if you believe in this, why don't we use the tariffs then to protect our steel industry from dumped Chinese steel?
Yes.
From Chinese steel that is getting around the international trade agreements. China is clearly subsidising its steel industry in a way that's not consistent with its obligation under the World Trade Organization. So if you're okay to tariff steel if they're not meeting some climate agreement, why don't we put tariffs on our domestic steel when they're not meeting trade agreements?
All right, Nick.
Now, I have argued for the latter. The former, though, the environmental one, the problem with those is you're adding an additional cost. It's an additional cost for Australian consumers. It's an additional cost for steel production in this country, for building costs in this country. For what benefit? Like, we're not changing the environment there. But the subsidised steel that comes in from China is clearly breaching trade agreements. It's clearly distorting world markets. Why don't we get back to being self-sufficient in steel? We only produce enough steel
Yeah,
for half our needs right now.
really
So forget
quick
about
here,
the
Nick, 'cause I
climate
wanna get
stuff.
off to a break.
Why don't we get serious about the abuse that China's doing to world trade markets? That's exactly what Trump's doing, really, in essence.
The red hat
Why don't we do that?
Go for it, Nick.
That's right.
Well, look, I absolutely agree. We should not be tolerating those practices, whether it's China or any country for that matter. But the Australian
we
approach
do.
on these things is to say we support a rules-based order. And so, for example, with the Trump tariffs on Australia, the Australian response was, well, we're not going to match it. Which, you know, at first people think, oh, is that the right thing to do? But it's, well, if you support a rules-based order, you're not going to go down that pathway. So I absolutely agree we should be responding strongly against dumping practices into our country. But you do that by going through the WTA, not responding with tariffs. That's the kind of current thinking on these
Not
matters.
working.
All right, I'm with you, gang.